Now, there's a very interesting article on the BBC Sport website. It looks back at the journey that New Zealand has taken to become the World Test champions. It looks at the 5 factors that took a country, the population of just 5 million, to the top of the world game. The article is adapted from a new book. It's called Crickonomics, which seeks to look at the past, the present and the future of cricket through the lens of never explored data. Other themes explored include: why does England rely on private schools for batsmen but not for bowlers? Why are batsmen paid more? Why does the women's game lend itself so much to innovation? And also, how does the weather impact who wins? So I'm joined by the co-author of the book, Tim Wigmore, who won the Wisden Book of the Year for his Cricket 2.0 inside the T20 revolution. And Tim also, of course, writes for the Daily Telegraph. Welcome, Tim. It might be. Is your debut on here? I think it might be.
I've done a couple of things before, I guess.
Have you? Good. Well, I think it's the first time I've looked you in the eye. So welcome, anyway. Welcome here. You better explain what Crickonomics is, first of all. I mean, it's a word that not many people might not be familiar with.
So it's a new book I've co-written with Stefan Szymański, who some listeners might know as the author of Soccernomics,
right.
Which did something similar for football, really. So basically using numbers and stories to try and kind of interrogate questions and give us a deeper understanding about the sport.
Right. Data is a fairly new thing. How far back can you go when you're exploring these things?
You can kind of go a long way back through different prisms. So we've got something on league cricket actually in England, the Lancashire Leagues, and sort of looking at it as the great missed opportunity for the English game, because there was a chance to develop. You had all these fantastic West Indies players, especially, and
Indeed.
Australians who were playing Lancashire Leagues, and there was the chance to develop a kind of a pyramid system like you have in football, which was rejected, a bit of a sliding doors moment for the game. So we're looking at really cricket on and off the field, and just trying to get a deeper sense of the forces that are driving the game. And it's a lot of England, but also it's a very global book as well in its conception.
And do you find answers to every question that you raise?
We don't find answers to everything, no, which is part of the fun of it. There were some times we disagreed as well, but I think we've learned a lot in doing it, and some really counterintuitive things as well. So we have a chapter on the revolution in run rates in Test match cricket. Everyone thinks T20 is changing Test cricket, is changing Test batting. Batsmen are not approaching the game the same way. But actually, if you look at the surge in run rates, it actually happens before T20. It's a surge really caused by first Sri Lanka, actually, under Sanath Jayasuriya.
Yes.
His approach, they begin to be the first team to really have a spike in their run rates, and then we see that take to a new level by Steve Waugh's Australia team with Alan Gilchrist and stuff. And actually, since T20, if you look, there's always been no change at all. So it's hard to see an impact actually of T20 on batting approaches in Test cricket, which is probably counterintuitive to what a lot of us would think. It's only what we thought before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, cricket has adapted so much, hasn't it? I mean, I don't know how many other sports have evolved quite as much as cricket has over the last 120 years or so.
Yeah, I mean, I think the greatest myth about cricket is it's a conservative game. And if you look at it, this is not true at all. It's always adapting. And you look at T20, for example, I mean, there's no other sport which has been able to develop a whole new format and has been so successful and as popular as T20. So a lot of other sports are very envious of T20 and how cricket's been able to do that. And for all its challenges at the moment, cricket has 3 distinct international formats. At its best, that should be a real strength for the game. And I know we love to have these sort of culturals in cricket and presenting these formats in opposition to each other, but actually the game has adapted and it continues to
because
adapt.
those formats all work, and there's a bit of artificiality, isn't there, about the one-day games, the 50 overs or the T20, because it has to be, but nothing like when you try and look at cut-down versions of other sports,
rugby sevens and
what they have to actually do to try and get a shortened form of the game. I think we're really. I've always argued that we're really lucky in cricket that we do have 3 really solid, very different formats that all work.
Yeah, and you can, as I do, you can like them all, or you can just prefer Test or T20, and that's fine. There's not the need to have these formats so much in opposition with each other, although of course T20 has undeniably changed the dynamics for Test cricket, and one of the big shifts we're seeing at the moment is almost a kind of football style rise of club cricket compared to international cricket. So if you look throughout history,
so do you mean franchise cricket? Do you mean Mumbai Indians and so on,
well,
that sort of club cricket?
T20 competitions around the world fought by clubs or franchises or whatever you call them. So if you look at the history of cricket, actually cricket is very unusual in historically generating so much of its money from international cricket and so little from domestic matches.
Yes.
And so until T20 comes in 2003, about 90% of cricket's cash actually comes from international matches, which is very unusual. Football was more like 80% comes from domestic club matches.
Yes.
And cricket's been on this journey. It's now got to the stage of about half its income coming from domestic and half from international matches. And we think that's an unfinished revolution, if you like, and we're seeing more and more leagues come up. There's a very lucrative new league in the UAE, which I think will have a huge impact on the game. And so we're seeing this shift more and more, and so club cricket is on the ascendancy, and there's a question for international cricket about how it adapts to this landscape. So you have global events which are doing really, really well. So the World Cups and stuff, they're hugely popular. Nothing to worry about there at all. But one of the big worries is for normal bilateral cricket, normal nation v nation outside World Cups, especially beyond Australia, England and India, which is how we have a very bizarre and quite worrying situation for Test cricket fans, where New Zealand's the World Test champions, but from a very small market, they lose about $500,000 per Test match that they stage at home.
Well, that's a remarkable statistic. That really is. And how do they lose that money?
Well, so New Zealand obviously is very far away from everywhere apart from Australia. So the costs of bringing their opponents there are huge. You have the staging costs, the hotels, the security costs. You've obviously got to assume that matches will go 5 days, even if they don't. So you have those sort of sunk costs. And because of New Zealand's time zone, basically, it's not a great time zone for either England or for the subcontinent. So it's
broadcast rights.
So it's broadcast rights are not worth a huge amount, basically. Yeah. And so, Test cricket there relies on subsidy. It's a loss leader, which is a real concern for the game, that you only have Test cricket really in 3 countries is making money. And even in Australia, if they host a lower ranked side, that's not necessarily a particularly commercially attractive series either. Yeah,
I was pretty depressed at Lords by what Greg Barclay had to say. He's the chairman of ICC, and it's almost as if he's kind of surrendered. That I wanted to hear the ICC stand. No, of course, we still have great faith in Test cricket. We want it to be very much part of the future. But it was almost ran up the white flag, it seemed.
Yeah, it had an air of kind of managing decline being the kind of limit of his ambition. So the interesting thing about the ICC is its powers are very limited, and they're limited deliberately by the members who really kind of wield all the power. So Greg Barclay, the chairman, is in a pretty compromised position in many ways. But of course, he was predicting less Test cricket in the future, and in Crickonomics, our book, we actually show this is already happening. So at the start of the 2000s, there were an average of 51 Test matches a year. In the last 4 years before COVID happened, so 2016 to 19, there were only 45 Test matches a year. So that's already a decline, and we're seeing basically 2 Test series have become the norm when you don't have one of England, Australia or India playing. Yes. So New Zealand, for example, they only really play 2-match series at home now. Test cricket is already in this position where it's scheduling fewer matches, and I suppose that is the hope of the World Test Championship, that it brings new relevance, and it means fans have a stake in matches not involving their own countries. I actually think the first cycle worked pretty well considering the difficulties of COVID, but it kind of speaks to the kind of compromises inherent in world cricket, that you have this league where it's not really a league because some teams play twice as many as others, and you have a very weird, confusing point system to determine it. It's not, you want something you can explain on the back of a fact packet, and that's not it, unfortunately.
No, it's not. So let's start with New Zealand then, and the rise of New Zealand, who a few years ago was always one of those examples. There'd be New Zealand, there'd be West Indies, where everyone said, well, look, Test cricket's going to be finished there, for the reasons actually that you mentioned, losing all that money for every match. But then 2013 to 2021, they won 35 tests and lost 17 in that time. And I'm really interested in how you charted that progress, if you like, up to the top. The things that they had to do, that the administrators had to work out, and how they've kind of embraced the whole cricketing structure, really, haven't they?
Yeah, I think it's a very important story because we're in an age where the big three seem to have so much dominance off field and often on it as well, that the rise of New Zealand, basically, who have, remember, the smallest population of any of the 12 test nations, obviously cricket very much in the shadow of rugby there.
Yes.
So what they've been able to do is really remarkable, and I think there are important lessons for other countries. So clearly you have a number of very fine players who have come up at a similar time. You had Brendan McCullum, and then the generation now with Kane Williamson, Trent Bolt and Tim Southee and so on. But actually, I think what we do, we say, yeah, sure, they've had these great players, but what are the deeper reasons? And a few that I would point to as being particularly important. New Zealand, basically, they fix the pitches in the country, which is so fundamental. And we always talk about it in England. We're talking about it yet again now in county cricket and the pitches. So in the early 2000s, the pitches in New Zealand were very, very seam-friendly. Again, not unlike we see in lots of counties. And New Zealand had one of the lowest first-class averages in any domestic competitions in the world. And since 2010, actually, they've had the highest average of any domestic competition in the world. So their wickets at home have come a lot closer to replicating those you get in Test cricket, which I think is good both for batsmen to develop the sort of skill, how to develop long innings, and also for bowlers to work out how to get wickets on these pitches. So what New Zealand did, they had a real focus on their domestic infrastructure. They had a warrant of fitness, which was basically a minimum standards for grounds, was introduced in 2005, because before they would play on sort of 25 different grounds a season in their domestic matches, which would be very charming going to a local small town.
New Plymouth and places like that.
Yeah, but not necessarily fit for purpose to develop international players. So that's been a really important thing that they've done. They've also had a real focus on their A-team, which is really, really significant. I think something, again, England could learn from. So the A-team is basically a bridge between your domestic competition and the international game. And they've had a system where they even got the domestic teams to agree to have fewer first-class matches a few years ago in order explicitly to fund extra A-team matches. And I think that speaks to the whole kind of culture there that's very much geared towards the national team being first. So this is very explicit. So you even have New Zealand cricket pay a portion of each domestic coach's salary, and they're explicitly judged on their ability to develop players for the national team. And it's a very symbiotic relationship. So we talked with Mike Hesson, who was New Zealand's coach for a long time, and he said that when he was coach, he actually, on several occasions, he would call up the domestic coaches and ask for a player to be moved around. So this happened with BJ Watling. So he was an opener for Northern Districts, and Hesson wants him to be wicketkeeper for the Test team. So obviously he needs to get his position changed for his domestic team, and he calls up the coach, and he gets him moved from opener to number 5 in keeper, and he becomes arguably New Zealand's best ever wicketkeeper in Test cricket. And we saw something interesting happen with England in the first Test at Lords. So Ollie Pope came out to bat at number 3, and he's never batted in the top 3 for Surrey. And I know Surrey did not have any contact from the ECB saying, could you move Ollie Pope up to 3? I'm sure had Surrey been asked, they'd have been very open to that.
I wonder if they would have done it.
Well, that's a question. I think
it's not nearly so cut and dried here, is it? We don't have that relationship. I mean, I don't think counties do have that sort of relationship.
I suppose we've seen this again and again, often before an Ashes series where you get Australian players come and play for a county for a few months. No, so that relationship it's always had that sort of element of tension to it between domestic teams and the national team. And I suppose one of the reasons, a positive reason actually, is that English first-class cricket is better supported than first-class cricket anywhere else in the world. So you have the kind of pressures of the county members wanting their team to win, and someone like New Zealand doesn't really have that, which means everything can be quite ruthlessly really geared towards what's best for the national team, and you kind of cut away all the other competing interests and just have a very clear, what's going to help New Zealand.
And does that include promotion and relegation? Because that clearly drives a lot of the counties' self-interest.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on there. I suppose simple as England has 18 teams, New Zealand and Australia both have 6. Obviously, England's population is much bigger, but you clearly have at times you have short-termism, both in terms of overseas players and also in terms of producing pitches that suit your seamers or whatever on a to help you win a couple of games, but they won't replicate what you get in Test cricket at all.
No. So do you argue that actually, there's a whole new structure going on, isn't there? Andrew Strauss is as we know, fronting this, or at least running this inquiry, restructuring inquiry into cricket. I mean, do you argue that county cricket perhaps shouldn't be so competitive amongst itself? It should be more of a New Zealand model. I mean, would you think that's a way to go or not?
So I think one of the big issues in county cricket is, if you think of like the Premier League football and the Championship in football, if you want to play for England, you have to play in the Premier League. It's not even a conversation. And I think you probably have, I don't know, a third of England's best players would play in Division 2 counties. We saw Ben Stokes, Durham, and so by that happening, you're diluting the quality in Div 1, and you'll mean the step up between Division 1 and Test cricket is higher. So that clearly, finding a way to concentrate that talent is a huge thing England should do. And I keep going back to this 18, but it's a massive thing. So you look at India and New Zealand have completely kind of reinvented the way they think about their A-team. So Mohammad Siraj, he played 24 A-team test matches for India before his first test for India, and then within a year for India, he'd bowled India to victories in Australia, England and South Africa. Yeah. So really showing the benefit of that education. And I think the last 10 batters for England to make their debut had at the time only played 18 matches for England in first class cricket, so that's under two each, and that's meaning that they're not really being given the best chance to succeed when they make that big step up to Test cricket. So I think England should be playing more A-team series at home as well as away, because you need to be able to play A-team series at home to get the good tools through India and so on.
Let's talk about India. I mean, you can't help but talk about India, can't you? Because I mean, their position of power in world cricket, I mean, must be all over your book, and that's been so dramatic, hasn't it? And I was intrigued by your charting of Natarajan in there, and how a cricketer like that these days can come through from almost a backwater, if you like, which I don't think would have happened 20 years ago in India. I mean, I doubt very much. I mean, MS Dhoni, of course, would be one who didn't come from one of the Mumbai, Calcutta, the big 5 or 6 cities in cricketing cities. But Natarajan's a really interesting case, isn't he? It demonstrates the modern India, if you like.
Yeah, so one of the things we wanted to ask in our book is, how has India got so much better? We all know that's happened. And then we looked at where India's players were coming from. And historically, India almost completely reliant on 6 states or so and the big cities within those to produce all their players. If you don't come from there, you've got almost no chance of playing for India. And there's been a real shift in recent years. So there's been basically an opening up of the Indian talent pool. So India are now accessing players who aren't growing up in Mumbai, Kolkata and so on. And that's obviously having a knock-on effect on the national team, because the national team has more players to access. And we saw that in that incredible victory at the Gabba, actually, a year ago, which was basically in India's second team. They were missing so many players, about 10 first-choice players were missing, and they still found a way to win.
Depth of resources, isn't it?
Yeah,
yes.
And so India's become better at sort of making good on the whole nation's talents, and it's done that. The IPL's been a big part of that, and the sort of scouting that's done. There's also been these state T20 leagues in Tamil Nadu and so on, which are actually very popular as well, and also do their own scouting. We've seen a rise of private academies. There's a Pace Academy, which has been very important for Indian cricket as well.
So Dennis Lilly one?
MRF, Pace Foundation. So basically, before in India, you had to attract the attention of your domestic selector in your state, otherwise your path was blocked. Now there's a series of different pathways to get into. So India's become more open to talents, and of course also India are paying domestic players so much more money. So actually you can have a great living now in India as just a very solid player in the Ranji Trophy and potentially the IPL as well, even if you don't get to the Indian team, which in turn is driving up those stands as well. So yeah, India's been very good at accessing a broader talent pool, and England in a small way has done the same. We've seen an incredible amount of players who've come from Durham.
Yes.
And actually we show in Crickonomics, that book, that before Durham gained first class status in 1992, Durham and Northumberland had barely produced any England players at all, and I think we've seen about a dozen from Durham since. So actually what that's happened, that's given England access to a new talent pool. So that's been a really positive story for English cricket. I mean, England's last 25 years without Durham as a first class county would have been a lot tougher, certainly.
They were always the county we dreaded playing, though, the minor county we dreaded playing in the knockouts, I can tell you. But I mean, India, with its population and now with this structure that you mentioned, and Natarajan being one of those who's recognised in one of those league T20s, wasn't he? Basically
Tamil Nadu.
Found his way through. They should be the team in the world by miles at everything, shouldn't they? I mean, Test cricket, T20 cricket, you name it. They seem to have got this structure now in this vast country of 1 billion people, and there were so many. Well, I first started going to India. You might go out into a country town to play one game, but there felt like a kind of a disconnect, really. You did have to be in one of those big ones. That has all changed, and so we should all be very fearful, shouldn't we, of India just taking over. They've got access to all of these vast numbers of cricketers now. Yeah.
So, and this revolution hasn't finished yet. So the kind of opportunities you're getting from smaller cities, especially, there's not been that. That's Rangers one. There's not been that many players from villages, but the smaller cities, especially, the opportunities there are getting better and better. So India's talent pool should only increase. And I don't think we're necessarily that far away from India A. You talk about India being the best team. I don't think we're that far away from India A being the second best team in the world, really.
That's fearful. Because actually, remember when MS Dhoni started, everyone would think, he's come from Ranchi. Hang on a minute, where is this place? Like it's some sort of little village.
It's 1 million
somewhere.
people.
There's 1 million people live in it. So there does need to be some sort of scale of all this, isn't there? Well, that's India. What about women's cricket then? Because again, going back and looking at the way that the game has evolved and progressed and so on. Actually, I suppose you could argue that women's cricket has evolved more than men's over that sort of time.
Yeah, so one of the things that's remarkable really is the amount of innovations that have been pioneered in the women's game and then been replicated in the men's game. So of course the World Cup, the first World Cup was in the women's game in 1973. We saw the first T20 International was in 2004. We've seen the first sort of structured league, the Women's ODI Championship, which has now been basically men have tried to copy in the Test Championship, and women's game has moved much more decisively towards embracing T20 as its main format. So yeah, women's game, the history of it, and I think in many ways because of its challenges, it's been a lot more nimble. It's been easier to sort of change stuff than in the men's game, and that's led to a lot of. It's been a very, very dynamic. The administration has been very, very dynamic, whereas in the men's game it can be a bit more cumbersome and difficult to get stuff through.
Is that just because of tradition, or do you think?
I think tradition is seen as more of a factor in the men's game. I also think there's often been kind of more stakeholders and more committees to get stuff through, whereas I think the women's administrators have been a bit more empowered to kind of go with where things are, so they can be a bit more nimble. For example, you haven't had the sort of historically the men's future tours program has been knocked out 8 years in advance. Actually, the world changed a lot in 8 years. The women's game had been a bit freer to adjust to where the wind's blowing, which has been a positive.
I remember Rachel Hayhoe Flint saying that she had to go out and literally sell tickets herself for that first World Cup.
And she was writing the match reports.
I know. I mean, that seems incredible. If it keeps progressing as it is at the moment, the women's game, can you see it being self-sufficient? Can you see it driving its own income and generating its own income and generating through broadcasting rights and so on? Do you think women's cricket will ever get to that size? I mean, in tennis now, the women are paid the same as the men, aren't they? Which that just seems to be a long way away from cricket, that sort of level.
Yeah, so the ICC, I think, have an ambition by 2031 for equal prize money in the men's and women's ICC events. The women's game is progressing fast, and I think one of the really interesting questions which we discuss is whether the women's game will have a different hierarchy of countries. And I think there's a really exciting chance if there's enough targeted investment to have a different hierarchy. So we saw Thailand qualify for the Women's T20 World Cup in 2020. So a bit like you have in football, you have USA and China being very good historically in women's football, not so much in men's football. So with the right investment, you have a chance for that happening in the women's game as well. And of course, lower down associates who are being smart, they're actually recognising now that your investment at this stage tends to go further in the women's game, and therefore it can be a shrewd move to kind of get behind it. So we saw in Brazil, they became I think, the first country to introduce professional contracts for women's cricketers before men's cricketers a few years ago. So there's a real kind of exciting moment potentially for women's cricket to be a real tool to globalise the sport.
And is that because, without being harsh, but the sort of the standard of the game down at that level actually, it's quite easy to perform well in there if you do spend a bit of money on coaching and so on. I mean, the standard is quite low at that level, so you can rise the ladder, you can climb the ladder pretty quickly.
So I think what I would point to is basically, if you think of, you're kind of trying to catch up with England and Australia in men's cricket, they've got basically 150 years on you.
Yes.
And the women's game, that is not nearly as true. So you do have a chance to rise quicker, and the game it changes so quickly. Of course, as this is through T20 largely. So again, that's often a format where I suppose emerging teams have more chance, and also you need less infrastructure to develop a top T20 side than to develop a top Test team.
I'm chatting to Tim Wigmore here. We've got another 5 or so minutes to go. He's got a book out called Crickonomics, which we're chatting away through. It's charting cricket and its development and all the various issues that there are around that. New Zealand will put into bat, and they're 108 for 2. And they'll be underway again here in about 6 or 7 minutes or so. What about schools? And it just feels at the moment in cricket in this country that it's becoming more and more and more of a private school game. It feels that way because of facilities and the lack of playing fields and so on that there is, particularly in inner cities. A, is that right? And B, how does that reflect, do you think, with the rest of the world? I'm thinking particularly, I guess, of Australia, who are still our greatest rivals and have an education system, I suppose, similar to ours. How does that all stack up?
Yeah, so this became a big talking point really after England's Ashes defeat. It became one of the things people were really scrutinising, and rightly so. So the share of England cricketers who predominantly go to independent schools, that has risen substantially since kind of post the Second World War. So There's been a real shift, and one of the really interesting parts is that shift has been unequal between different types of players. So an England batter who plays Test cricket is about twice as likely as an England bowler to have gone to a private school before.
How does that work out then? So nice services to bat on.
So we think that basically, if you look at batsmen and bowlers, nature and nurture. So for bowlers, nurture is a bit more important. So if you have the athleticism and height to be 6'5", very athletic and so on, that is, you can't buy that advantage. Whereas with batters, access to coaching, access to facilities, good wickets, and actually just enough practice time is more important. So it's kind of easier to make a batter. Probably more people, I think, in theory, if they're given the opportunity, have the capacity to bat for England than they do to bowl for England. And we're seeing a real, almost an arms race really in terms of facilities at different private schools. So Scarborough College, I know they now have 4 former international cricketers as coaches.
Really?
So and that you probably traditionally would have 1 cricket pro.
Yes.
Now if you have 3 or 4, so that advantage you get from going to a private school has got bigger. And of course these coaches, as well as being probably very good in their own right, they'll also have friends from the county game and stuff. So if you're talented enough, you're going to be put onto that path as well.
I was interested in what you wrote about sort of image of English independent schools and Australian, and that there was, I think,
Ed Cowan.
You've got Ed Cowan, who said that he felt that it was almost a disadvantage in Australia to come from a private school because you were considered to be a bit of a softie. Whereas, of course, the view here in England is you were very privileged to go to a private school, and you had probably more opportunity or more chance or likely to be picked because you had that grounding to talk about. Whereas I think Ed Cowan argued that actually you had to really convince the selectors that you're up for it.
Yeah, so this is certainly the image, and Australia loves to say how egalitarian Australia is and how unegalitarian England is. But that's the image, and then we looked at the reality, and this really surprised us, probably one of the things that most surprised us. So we found that in the 2010s, 45% of England's Ashes players had gone to private schools, probably quite unsurprising. But then 44% of Australia's Ashes players had also gone to private schools.
Okay.
So
including the captain, of course, at the moment, the current captain.
Yeah, exactly. So Australia is basically relying as much on private schools for players as England are, which would certainly jar with a lot of Aussies.
And is that a concern? It certainly worries me that there isn't the access for schools.
But then 44% of Australia's Ashes players had also gone to private schools. So
including the captain, of course, at the moment, the current captain.
Yeah, exactly. So Australia is basically relying as much on private schools for players as England are, which would certainly jar with a lot of Aussies.
And is that a concern? It certainly worries me that there isn't the access for school kids to play cricket. Now I think there's so many kids want to play it. I was walking back from the Oval a couple of years ago to try and find my car and the gasometer, and I heard there's a school playing ground near there. And I thought, oh, they'll be playing football. I could hear all the noise and that you associate with young kids playing sport. And actually, as I approached it, and this is in South London, they were playing cricket. It was quite chaotic. There were about 5 or 6 games going on, but it was September. It was actually in the football season. Yeah, it was in the autumn term, if you like. And they were doing the best they could on a tarmac area. They want to play. They want to play, don't they? So, that reliance on public schools, it's an expensive game too, isn't it? There are lots of barriers at the moment, it seems, to kids not to play cricket.
Yeah, and even when kids do, often the county pathway system is really set up to protect those from private schools. And one of the worst examples of this is you often get a kind of county under 13 coach who will also do private coaching on the side, and therefore he's subconsciously or otherwise, he will be inclined to favour those who also pay him to do his private coaching as well.
Yes.
That sort of practice is terrible and really damaging. And we are seeing some of the private schools, they are so desperate to develop players because for them it's a marketing tool as well. And the facilities at these schools are extraordinary. So at Millfield, which has, I think, got a dozen players, a dozen men's players in the first class game at the moment, to give a sense of what they have nets that replicate bouncy conditions at the Wacker and turning conditions in Chennai, as well as normal, in inverted commas, English wicket.
That's like the academy in Dubai.
It is, yeah.
It's ridiculous.
And in many ways, the kind of arms race between private schools is akin to the arms race between football academies, but that's between different clubs.
Yes.
And English between different schools.
These schools have got to let kids on there and play, haven't they? That's got to be part of the answer.
I mean, the amount of fantastic facilities which are basically just
sitting
left
there,
unused
wasted
for 2 months in the summer.
It's outrageous.
There's so many things are so hard to fix. There's also a lot of low-hanging fruit. If you can get heads together, you can make a real difference as well.
Quick one, Tim, because the bell's gone. This tournament in UAE in January, then, I mean, you talk about it being a real sort of mega tournament. I mean, is this going to be a potentially the straw that breaks the camel's back? I mean, yet another huge T20 tournament luring players away from playing for their countries.
So we're seeing IPL owners being they're bankrolling the teams there as well. We've seen that Australia want to avoid scheduling clashes between their ODIs and this tournament in the future. So it's going to be probably the second highest paid tournament for players. It's another step on the road for the kind of the rise of club cricket, which we talk about, and another huge challenge for the international game.
Yeah. We'll keep an eye on that. Tim, thank you much indeed for coming in. Tim Wigmore, Crickonomics. Loads and loads to go through in there. Thanks for coming to see us, Tim, and good luck with the book.